Dialga Arceus solidifies its spot at the top of the metagame, Rampardos Lucario rises up as the #1 counter, and Origin Form Palkia of all things has a breakout weekend. Let's go ahead and dive on into our weekly meta report for Pokemon Pocket. Looking at the over 2,000 deck lists played in Pokemon Pocket's largest tournaments this weekend, we see 4 standouts as the most popular decks. Dialga Arceus coming in #1 with a bullet at 23% of the starting field. Rampardos Lucario coming in second at 12.5%. 18 Trainer Misty variations coming in third at 7.5%, and a Manaphy double Palkia deck featuring Origin Form Palkia being the 4th most popular deck coming in at 4%. Everything else being played in our 53% other part of the field was 3% or less of individual deck lists. To make some week-over-week metagame comparisons to our starting distribution last week, the first weekend of the Triumphant Light metagame, we see Dialga Arceus doubled its starting metagame share up from 11.5%, while a number of previous metagame powerhouses essentially disappeared this week. Darkrai Magnezone, Celebi variations with Leafeon and Executor, and Charizard all shrunk from reasonable metagame shares to that 3% or less grouping that is now lumped in with the other half of our pie chart. Next up, to look at the performance of our top archetypes, we examined the 251 deck lists from our sample that had a 70% win rate or higher. Drawing some comparisons between our starting and top performing distributions, we can see that all 4 of our most popular archetypes increased in metagame percentage between these two groups. In specifics, Dialga Arceus went from 23 to 32%, or a 39% increase. Rampardos Lucario went from 12.5 to 15.5%, or a 24% increase. 18 Trainer Misty variations went from 7.5 to 9%, or a 20% increase. And Manaphy Palkia variations went from 4% to 5%, or a 25% increase overall. Thinking about the changes in our week-over-week metagame, I think a lot of them make sense when we look at the matchup tables of our top deck in our developing metagame, the Dialga Arceus. Both the Darkrai, Magnezone, and the Celebi Grass variations that fell off very hard between the first weekend and the second have very poor matchups there, while the Rampardos Lucario deck that has risen to the second most popular deck has a very strong matchup into the #1 deck. It's worth calling out that not every deck that has a poor Dialga Arceus matchup saw a reduction in play rate this week, however. In particular, the 18 Trainer Misty variations really struggle against the most popular deck in the format, but they look to be taking up a position in our top deck Rock, Paper, Scissors, being weak to Dialga, but accelerating at having a strong matchup into the Rampardos Lucario fighting variation, which is the counter pick to the #1 deck. Let's kick off looking at specific deck lists by taking a peek at the Rampardos Lucario deck that was the second most played thing across our major tournaments this weekend. This deck's 2 namesakes are its headlining threats that work well in tandem together. Rampardos' 130 damage attack when paired with Lucario's plus 20 damage means you clear out a Dialga in a single shot, and thanks to Arceus' weakness, you even clear that when it's wearing a cape. This makes you especially well positioned into the best deck in the format because you have a single knockout point Pokemon that takes out their really heavy investments in one go. This deck list also gets to leverage new fighting tool from the Triumphant Light expansion in Sudowoodo that can deal a whopping 70 damage for a single energy to an Arceus thanks to weakness, or in tandem with a Lucario can take down things like a Dialga in just a couple of hits under the right conditions. A lot of the details in these deck lists are pretty set in stone. You're trying to play a stage 2 and a stage 1, and generally at least one copy of Pokemon Communications, which fills up a lot of your deck slots. Past that, you generally want 1 Cyrus and 1 Sabrina to be able to have utility to push your opponent's Pokemon around, which means basically your flexes are, do you want access to Mars Shadow or a second copy of Sudowoodo? Do you want a utility card like X Speed or Leaf, or do you want the second communication to play a little bit more utility? Looking at the matchup data for this Rampardos deck, it's winning over 60% of the time against the Dialga Arceus best deck in the format, but it's coming up a bit short against things like 18 trainer variations and less popular Arceus decks that are playing things like Carnivine and Heatran that aren't necessarily weak to things like Pseudo-Wudo that can also run you down before you get set up with something like a Stage 2 Rampardos. Our other breakout archetype in this second weekend is the new Manaphy build featuring Origin Form Palkia. This deck list won the Hooglandia Spraggles tournament and has made deep runs in a number of other community events as well. This deck list follows the mold that in my experience has been the most successful for these Manaphy shells, which in particular is you want to lead on Manaphy and then follow it up with a good single knockout point Pokemon, in this case Origin Form Palkia, that can deal some damage for you, and then you clean up by ending on a powerful EX Pokemon, in this case Palkia EX, once your opponent has already gone through 2 single knockout points. This deck follows a model similar to the Arceus Dialga deck, where all of the strong things you're doing are packed into basic Pokemon so they don't take up a lot of deck slots. This lets you play a wide variety of utility cards, which in the case of water decks means that you not only get 2 copies of Misty, but you also get 2 copies of Irida to provide you with lots of valuable healing to make your opponent have difficult breakpoints to hit consistently. Looking at the matchup data for this Manaphy variation, it makes me think that we'll probably see this one increase in metagame share overall because it has pretty even matchups against the 3 popular decks above it, and decks that tend to be 50% against the field are ones that players that are frequently playing tournaments tends to gravitate towards because it lets them have a chance in every game that they're playing. Next up, I'd like to talk about some trends among the other popular decks, starting with Dialga Arceus. Looking at the most successful builds of this archetype this week, it becomes clear that playing 2 copies of Leaf as opposed to trying to play things like Sky Shaman has ended up being the most successful. We also see Mew EX included in more of the successful lists than not, rounding out their 6 different Pokemon. I would expect this is likely to become more important than ever if the Palkia Manaphy deck that we talked about just before this becomes popular as well, because Mew's a really important counterplay card there, letting you Dimensional Storm back their Palkia after it hits you the first time, or just any time it's simply in the active spot. The other thing worth calling out among most of the successful Dialga Arceus builds is that most of them are playing 2 copies of Giant Cape, 2 copies of Potion, and at least 1 of the Healing Shaman. Having a ton of sustain built into your deck lets you survive the early onslaught from various things in the games where you don't have an ideal start without first energy advantage or just missing your Dialga lead. Looking at 18 trainer Misty variations, we see a lot of overlap in the support cards being played in the top performing builds. In particular, Heavy Sustain, Potion, Irida, and 2 copies of Giant Cape are present in almost all of the top performing deck lists. One noteworthy thing from last week's data into this week is that last week I talked explicitly about how the Articuno 18 trainer builds were outperforming Palkia by a similar margin. I'm not really sure exactly what changed in the metagame this particular week, but the matchup data is much closer between the two, with there not really being a standout as to which of these 2 Water EX Pokemon is going to give you better results. I'd like to wrap things up today, as always, by highlighting a number of innovations and counter picks to the top meta things that put up a handful of results in tournaments this week, but they're all new enough that they weren't played enough to make it onto the pie charts. The first of these is a Starmie variation playing 15 trainers and a single copy of Palkia as an additional Pokemon. I really like this deck from a concept / theory standpoint. The 18 trainer Palkia deck struggle with dealing big bursts of damage multiple turns in a row, and the Articuno deck needs 2 heads on a Misty to really get blasting, whereas Starmie, when going second, organically just does 90 damage on your second turn after dealing 20 on the first, and when you're going first with it, a single Misty heads lets you crack for 90 right away, clearing a lot of things out before they even get a chance to get going. While this deck list is going to be a little bit less consistent than those 18 trainer ones because you're looking to assemble a stage 1 Pokemon, copies of Pokemon Communication help mean that you're going to get to that more frequently, and once Starmie gets online, I think you're going to lose far fewer games than the 18 trainer decks do, even after they occasionally hit on Misty. There are actually a lot of variations of Gyarados decks that spiked results this weekend in a lot of different tournaments, and I think from a theory standpoint, that makes a lot of sense to me. The 180 HP that it has is really bulky. It's never going down in one hit to an Arceus, or even after a Dialga chip shots you for 30 and then Arceus comes in to clean up, and it dealing 140 damage, especially in tandem with the 2 copies of Rocky Helmet that we see in both of these decks, means that you are clearing out opposing copies of Arceus or Dialga, sometimes even if they have a cape attached to them. The 2 iterations here play in slightly different ways. One of them is very similar to the Origins Palkia deck that we looked at previously, leading on Manaphy into a single knockout point Pokemon into finishing on a copy of Gyarados EX, while the other one is the more kind of traditional Gyarados shell, where you're stalling with Druddigon, or in this case Kangaskhan, up front, and then building up your Gyarados EX in the back of it. I'm not sure that either of these are necessarily optimal, but I definitely think it's worth exploring this card some more, and I also don't think it's a coincidence that a majority of the Gyarados decks that spiked results this week are moving away from the less consistent Stage 2 Gyarados Greninja that we saw dominating in previous metagames as basic Pokemon have gotten stronger. Lastly, Darkrai Weavile put up some surprise results for me in the Hooglandia Spragos tournament. We had exactly 7 people playing this out of almost 900 competitors, and 2 of them made our top 64 cut. I think the standout thing about the 2 successful deck lists in my mind is that they're all playing 2 copies of Dawn, which lets you be incredibly aggressive in a way that hits good breakpoints in the Dialga matchup. If you're going first and you have Sneasel, Weavile, Darkrai with the Dawn, you get to go ahead and attach your energy to the Darkrai on your second turn. Dawn it up to the Sneasel after you deal 20, evolve into Weavile and hit for 70. The following turn, you get to go ahead and do that again, hitting for another 90, which is a total of 180, which notably clears the Dialga through a copy of Cape or Potion, plus a Shaman activation, letting you pick up those first 2 points early, meaning you only have to knock out one more thing, such as that Shaman hiding on their bench, or the Arceus they've attached energy to afterwards, which with Weavile plus Darkrai shouldn't be too much of a problem. I think having a really strong draw into the best deck's good draw when they are going second is really appealing out of this archetype. If you're interested in finding more sweet deck lists that aren't being played in large numbers yet so they didn't make the meta roundup report like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss my new decks roundup tomorrow morning, where I've combed through the over 2,000 tournament deck lists played and grabbed all of the sweetest ones that spiked individual results. As for our current metagame, it looks like we're heading into a mostly equilibrium standpoint. The Dialga Arceus decks are still posting strong results, but their performance metric wasn't nearly as dominating as it was in the first week, as natural counters rose up like the Rampardos deck and even the Origins Palkia Manaphy deck that are able to have a pretty even match up into it. What have you been finding success with at home? Are you finding that there's things you can brew that give you counterplay into this format, or have you been falling short and this video is able to give you some more ideas, hopefully? If you enjoyed my roundup on everything, make sure you smash that like button on today's video so that way I can hopefully reach more people. I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through the end, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.